So, dear colleagues, welcome to this BrIAS Thursday seminar. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce today's speaker to you. Cristina Leston Bandeira is Professor of Politics at the University of Leeds in the UK. And she's the chair and co-founder of the pioneering International Parliament Engagement Network, the IPEN network. And even though her work focuses probably on the most traditional of representative institutions, I can honestly say that she's also one of the most innovative researchers I know. She's a leading scholar on parliaments and public engagement and was awarded the very prestigious UK Political Studies Association 2025 Sir Isaiah Berlin Prize for her outstanding professional contributions to political studies. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Didier, for introducing me and for inviting me, and Sylvia and the other side also from the French side of the university. The invitation was to come and talk to you, and you gave me leeway to decide on what I would talk, which is really generous of you. It can be quite dangerous, but very generous of you. And so what I'm going to do is basically doing a reflection on that title, Are Parliaments at Risk of Losing Their Relevance? And the reason why I'm reflecting on this is because this is a question that keeps coming to my mind more and more in recent times. And I think it actually is becoming an issue that really needs to be tackled much more seriously than what we have done in recent times. So, as Didier explained, my area of research is very much about parliaments and public engagement, citizen engagement. So it's a perspective from that, coming from that area. So I'll be talking about sort of setting out the problem as such, and then looking at how public engagement has been used as a response from parliaments, and how they've implemented it, and then I'll focus on a piece of work I did last year, which is the guides on citizen engagement for parliaments, and you'll see why, and then come to conclusions after that. I'm very short, so I hope that the microphone is picking me up. I can feel a bit under the microphone. Great, thank you. So, setting the problem. Coming from the more traditional, as you say, perspective on political institutions, so I've studied parliaments for over 30 years, and I started looking at parliaments. I was still in Portugal at the time, and looking at parliament in the context of a new democracy, and seeing it very much as the core of a democracy, and there should be the representative institution that links citizens to governance in one way or another, and they are should be very much at the core of that fabric of how the democratic system works. However, the more we've developed, the more our societies have changed in terms of exchange of information, in terms of expectations from people, the more I think that idea of the representative parliament has been questioned, and the more we're looking at parliaments actually as doing something else, but not necessarily that representative chain that we all expected. So there used to be, or the idea of the framework of parliament is very much that we delegate to it the chain of representation. We give consent to people to act on our behalf. And that might have worked at the beginning of the 20th century, might have worked in the middle of the 20th century. Today, it doesn't work as much. And increasingly, you see statements like this one by the Speaker of the Parliament of Uruguay, Rodrigo Goñi, about questioning the model of representation. So what he says here is that what is clear is that representation has changed substantially. What is clear is that everything is upside down, and we hear this idea of upside down, different, new, all the time in different contexts, and that the classic traditional intermediation of representation has been shattered now. Now I think the new has not yet arrived, and this is the idea of the new has not yet arrived. We still have our political structures, our political frameworks, processes in our democracy which are core in terms of people go to elections, elect people to act on your behalf, there's accountability, scrutiny mechanism with government, and then outputs come from that. And increasingly, that's not necessarily being linked to the reality of what happens in society. And so what we see is different modes of democracy have expanded increasingly in the last decades, sort of started in the late 20th century, but far more than in the 21st century. And whilst representative democracy has been strengthened and reinforced as a model, and you see, again, if you look at new democracies, elections is always at the core of it. Forming a free independent parliament is always at the core of it, with free independent parties, etc. What we see also is an expansion of other forms of democracy, like participatory democracy, advocacy democracy, but also direct democracy. Referendums are much more popular. So the issues of legitimacy are much more questioned. They're not necessarily linked anymore specifically only to one pathway, the representative way of doing democracy. And what I argue is that we still don't really know how to navigate this whole system. Parliaments are still very much looking into themselves, doing their own thing, and not necessarily doing those bridges. Now, of course, there are examples where that's not happening. There's examples of innovation. There's example of, including here in Brussels, obviously, of integrating different ways of bringing in citizens to the core decision making. But overall, for the most part of it, we still don't really know how to conciliate those different dynamics. And this is something I wrote about 10 years ago, that this idea that we've moved from the representative parliament, so the model of a representative parliament, which would be the model of parliament in the 20th century, where parties very much mediated that relationship between citizens and governance through parliament. People voted in parties, they acted in parliament, they scrutinized government. So it was the model of the representative parliament. Increasingly, in the 21st century, we've moved to what I refer to as the mediator parliament, because lots of different reasons, but parties do not necessarily have that core role anymore in terms of party membership dropping, parties changing all the time, and really many more voices outside Parliament trying to have a say, trying to contact governance and government, and sort of trying to ignore Parliament as a representative institution in terms of, committees, chambers, those places where the representative legitimacy is. However, and as I wrote about this 10 years ago, in a very optimistic way, I thought, right, now the role of Parliament is to be a mediator between all those groups out there and governance. And we know that parliaments they don't have much power, like effective power. Who has power is government. But parliaments can be very good at raising issues and scrutinising what government is doing. And if they have that role of mediator, then they can mediate with civil society, with citizens, and bring the issues with, considerable legitimacy to government and scrutinise them properly. However, increasingly, I don't see parliaments actually performing that role of mediator because of lots of different things I'm going to talk about in a minute. And I think that's quite worrying, because then we're thinking, why do we have the parliaments? Because they're being questioned all the time. So you see instances where parliamentarians are questioned all the time, instances of violence increasingly, violence to candidates, to members, obviously particularly if they're women, minoritized groups. And we see these developments, but also constant questioning of the formal institutions. And obviously we see this phenomenon across different types of institutions, from presidents to local councils to all sorts of different arenas. And sometimes that actually leads to violence. An extreme case, like for instance, in 2023, where there was an invasion of the Brazilian Congress because people were not happy with the way they were all Bolsonaristas. They were not happy with the election of the President Lula, and they would not accept. Obviously, I could have showed you another example too of that, but this is one I'm more familiar with, so this is the one I'm showing. And they completely, really destroyed. They invaded the building and destroyed many things within the building. But I could also show you the case of Kenya in 2024, where there were reactions against tax finance bill, where there was huge protests that people just were not happy with what the government was trying to bring in. And again, huge protests. Actually, several people died in these protests. Again, they invaded the parliament. And of course, these are extreme examples. This is not happening all the time, but there's small manifestations of this questioning thinking, what is the role of Parliament? What are you doing there? And there's sort of two parallel things happening here. One is that it sounds like parliamentary elites, parliamentary groups are not necessarily able to communicate with citizens or to understand the needs or to understand those expectations that citizens may have. And there's also from the side of citizens sort of maybe a not complete understanding of how Parliament's representation works and how to bring that mediation between different, your needs and governance. And obviously, this is a context of acute low levels of trust. I don't need to tell you about that. It's a quite wide range of phenomena. It's gone on for quite a few decades. And and that obviously will question the institutions, but also huge fragmentation. So if we go back to the representative parliament model in the 20th century, it was much clearer what the aggregation of the interests were, because parties were doing that. You had clear parties with defined ideologies that were aggregated those interests. And now those are much more fragmented, and it's much more difficult to aggregate that and have one voice for big groups. And then ideas like disintermediation, very much from the business social organizations research, the idea that there are no channels anymore, no official channels through which interests are mediated. And of course, parliaments to work require those channels to do that connection. And those are not there. If there's a multiplicity of different actors working in there, then it becomes much more difficult to do that bridge with citizens. And this one in particular, lots of noise. So noise is a concept from communication studies, and noise refers to basically too many people saying too many things all the time. We have an information overload. It's just not possible to keep track of all the information going on. So what do? We specialize. We listen to our own bubbles. We listen to the people we believe in or who identify ourselves. And we have sort of a polarization of views. Same time, we stop being able to understand the other view, the view on the other side, because we only listen to people who talk like us. But also, we have too many people saying too many things. How many influences do we have now? I don't think there's even one category anymore, influences. From young people who just trying to sell products to actually YouTubers with very, very strong ideologies on what they're trying to say, to celebrities, to politicians themselves. So many voices, and all of this creates that noise and sort of questions the idea of where are the official information, and that obviously leads to huge misinformation also developing, is also an issue, contributes to that idea of noise. There's actually Parliament's doing some interesting initiatives in this area. The Brazilian Parliament now has a whole program just about misinformation, about trying to question misinformation and putting information out there. But it's a really difficult thing to do because the problem is huge. It's all across society. And so it's in that context that increasingly parliaments are really just one very distant voice amongst many. So there's many people saying lots of things, and most people don't even necessarily differentiate parliament from government and sort of merge the two together, which then becomes an issue to the identity of parliament being there for the people, for scrutinizing, for all voices, because government is usually there for just one team, one program. And it's in that context that they lose their relevance. If people don't know what they do, if these institutions do, or if they increasingly struggle to actually bring in citizens' claims and citizens' issues and act on them, then that's when you start thinking about what's their relevance, other than every 4 or 5 years we elect a new group of people, and then we do it again every 4 or 5 years. So the way lots of parliaments have responded to this context, particularly decline of trust, has been by developing what they refer to as public engagement initiatives. As I say, particularly the decline in trust, the decline of voter turnout. If you do interviews to a lot of these people, why they develop these programs, those are the key things they want to address. And so let's look a little bit at what they've been doing, or actually before doing that, just thinking about what does it mean, public engagement? And this is what I'm asking you. Any ideas? What does it mean for you? You can tell me if you want to, or you can think in your own head. That's up to you entirely. And I partly ask this for lots of reasons. Partly ask this because the concept of public engagement doesn't actually necessarily exist in different languages. It doesn't exist in Portuguese, although the Brazilians are very good. They just adopt the English word and put an O at the end, and then suddenly we've got a new word, which is just very practical. And I put in brackets there, citizens. Some people prefer to talk about citizen engagement. I've got issues with the term citizen because not everyone is a citizen in the country. So I'd much rather say public engagement or people's engagement to include everyone. So the citizen, I understand why the term is used, but it can be problematic. So have you thought in your heads what sort of ideas come to you about public engagement? I wonder if any of these words was in when you thought about public engagement. So something people think about, I see some nods, so that's good. Some people think of public engagement as being about participation. That's the main thing people talk about, being about participation, or about democracy, or about transparency, openness. And it's probably about all of these different things. And what I say that is the most important, to me at least, concept in all of that is this idea of empowerment. So engagement is empowerment in relation to your surroundings. And that empowerment might happen because you've got information, you understand what the system is, the political system is, you understand the context, or it might be because you feel you're able to participate in an action. But it's not necessarily just about education or necessarily just about participation. It has to have an effect on you. If you're just attending an activity, participation activity, but that has no impact on yourself, then engagement is not happening. So if I think of the mixed committees, for instance, the deliberative system, if citizens go in there, but they just go through the routine of going through there, but actually then don't reflect about that, and that has no impact on them, then engagement is not necessarily happening, even though they are going through an activity of engagement, participation. And this matters because then it opens up much more, actually, what engagement is all about, and in this case, what parliaments can do about it. And I usually find it useful to differentiate between the activity itself, the effect it has on the citizen, or potentially has, and then the broader democratic aim. So the types of activity, if we look at the IPU Global Parliamentary Report on Public Engagement from 2022, they divide into 5 types of activities, which are those in there, from information all the way to participation. And they involve lots of different things in those. And then hopefully you'd have an effect on the citizen that they would feel welcomed, they would feel supported, they would feel listened to, they would feel valued, and they would feel empowered. This obviously is a very optimistic view of public engagement. Unfortunately, most of the cases, these things don't really happen, or they might happen sporadically, but not necessarily on a continuing level. But it's important to understand that doing the activity doesn't necessarily lead to those feelings. And I know of lots of initiatives that parliaments are doing, and many of them look amazing and very innovative and all that. But ultimately, are they having that impact on citizens? Are they actually making citizens feel empowered? And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. And ultimately, it might be about openness, legitimacy of democracy, trust, but it's actually about strengthening resilience. And I think increasingly the idea of resilience is really important, that it's not just about democracy working, elections happening, MPs talking in the chamber, doing reports in the committees, but it's actually building that wider reservoir of resilience within society where there is an acceptance of the system, an understanding of the system, but also the questioning of the system, which is absolutely normal and fine, but within the parameters of what the system allows you to do, rather than lots and lots of different bubbles happening all the time, and no one really knows where all of that is going. And and to give you a sense of how those different activities link, I usually like to talk about the public engagement journey, so that it's not just you go to an activity and then you're off you go. It's about, you know, getting informed, understanding the information. Again, parliaments are really good at bombarding people with information, or they say, oh, it's all on the website, it's all on the website. But I mean, which normal person goes to a parliament's website? My students might do, but no normal person does that. So it's about, you know, how do you communicate that in one language? Do they actually understand what's in there? And then it's about understanding the relevance to their lives also, to understand, you know, the decisions they're making there, how they impacted on your life, and then maybe getting involved. Not everyone wants to get involved. Some people are quite happy not to get involved, but it's about having at least an understanding what's going on. And some people will lead on to participating or even leading interventions. But within that cycle, it's really important feeling welcome, supported, empowered, listened to, and valued, which does not always happen. So the potential impacts of public engagement could be huge, about feeling confident, welcome, listened to, valued. And in terms of Parliament, it's about strengthened legitimacy, but also better lawmaking and better scrutiny. And I think often we forget about that. Often parliaments are still at the stage where they think, oh, we have to do these things so that people understand what we do, so we have more trust, more legitimacy. But they don't necessarily think about, actually, it also will help you to do better laws or to do better scrutiny, because you'll understand what are the issues that are affecting people, what people really feel about that. And ultimately, that would build resilience. So let's look a little bit more about how they're actually implementing public engagement. So the types of activities I'm talking about can be any of these and many more. So just visits to Parliament, school activities, website, social media, leaflets, etc. But then also like things like e-petitions, so different types of activities there. Testimonies towards scrutiny, like evidence given towards committees, for instance. Opinions on legislation going through Parliament. Quite a few parliaments have this now, where you can give views on legislation going through Parliament, but also things like citizens' assemblies, mini panels, which we have a few examples now, obviously, namely in Belgium, but also elsewhere. So it's a very wide range of types of activities, and you don't necessarily always have teams within parliaments talking with each other or understanding how all these things link together. So one of the areas I've done a lot of research in these is petitions, and a typical example of petitions is that you have maybe a petition site where you have no information about it, how it works, or no information about expectations, and so from the perspective of the person participating, it's a bit like a black hole, and yet, you know, you're asked to participate, but you don't necessarily know in what context, what for. When we look at, and this is a really, you know, broad brush from things I'm involved with, but when we look at what Parliament's actually doing within this field, the main activity, if you look globally, it's mainly around information education. So there's a lot of activity happening across the globe on trying to make information more understandable, lots of education programs, and a huge focus on youth engagement. So Parliaments are really alerted to the fact they need to focus on the youth. However, often that youth is people from already engaged backgrounds, from, you know, elite groups, high social economic backgrounds, people who probably would be engaged anyway, regardless of what parliaments did. So to move beyond that, they need to go beyond those groups. But overall, these are the main areas that parliaments are doing, really. So the area of education, participation, consultation, although they exist, obviously there's lots of activities in that, they're much less developed and much less thought through in terms of how they are implemented. Where you see the most attuned understanding of going beyond the usual suspects, for instance, it tends to be in education activities and not always necessarily in participation activities. And if we think about participation, usually people get involved with that anyway, those who are already more engaged, then you're just increasing the gap between those who are very engaged and those who are really not engaged at all. So there is an issue in here. And in a longer version of this, I had my next slide was going to be about core principles of engagement, but we don't have time for that. So instead, when I'm talking about back on the microphone. When I'm talking about what of impact, I'm going to refer to you to this visual summary, which is a visual summary of a chapter that I co-wrote with Didier on reimagining engagement between citizens and parliament, which was a lot of fun to put together, wasn't it? Because we could really think, what are the core principles? And, you know, in ideal times, what should that relationship feel like? So if anyone is interested, inside here, we've got our core principles, which are 6 principles. I'll leave it. So in terms of the impact, this is really an area where we need far more research. So if there's any students in here, anyone who wants to do research, please work on impact of public engagement. Because there's so much activity happening, there really is, but we know very little about the impact. But again, in very broad terms, because I'm here just, you know, broad strokes, is that although there's this huge expansion of activity, and there's no doubt about that, but just because these engagement initiatives exist, it doesn't mean that they are effective. And the main thing we see in these is being dominated by the usual suspects. And obviously the usual suspects vary from country to country, but they tend to be people from the elite groups. So they tend to be people who are from high social economic background, often also from the elites, from the groups who run the country anyway, and from the majority ethnicity from that country, etc. And that tends to be the trend. For parliaments to be able to go beyond the usual suspects, they really need to be much more proactive in promoting it. If they're not, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen automatically. They need to go to communities who would not know anything about Parliament and to talk in a language that those communities, you know, want to talk about things that those communities want to talk. There's one Parliament that is doing amazing work just right now on engaging with communities and seldom heard communities, and that's the Scottish Parliament. And for lots of different reasons, they've always done really, really good work, but at the moment they're doing particularly good work. And it's often very process-led rather than issue-led, which is really bugbear of mine. So if you want to engage with people, again, no normal people wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to engage with a parliamentary process. I'm going to engage with a community process. However, you might feel very strongly about transport. You might feel very strongly about health. It's the issues that connect with people. And although some parliaments are developing those more issue-led engagement, a lot of them are still very procedural, very bureaucratic. And a lot of the engagement tends to be what I refer to as broadcasting mode. So we're talking to you rather than listening. And obviously, a key thing for engagement to happen is to listen. Is to get a sense for, you know, that someone is actually paying attention to you. Now, that concept of listening is very subjective, and it'll feel different things for different people. But in many interviews that I've done with participants like petitioners, even if they don't get the outcome they were after, what really matters to them is that someone listened to them and actually sat down with them or talked to them and listened to their views. But often that's not happening. Often it's just broadcasting. And often it's disconnected from parliamentary business. So often you see like parallel worlds. The citizen engagement units doing lots of things, even if it might be consultation for committee, but then in committee are not necessarily listening directly to the views being put in there. So that link to parliamentary business is really important to, you know, provide more legitimacy to the lawmaking, scrutiny, etc. And that does not always happen. Obviously, the more integrated it is in Parliament, the more it's going to happen. And then it's often unclear in its purposes and outcomes. So in its purposes, often parliamentary teams don't really necessarily know what should be, what's the purpose of this, why are we doing this? Or they might know, but MPs might not be on board, or MPs might have a different view. And actually that's another issue, is parliamentary staff working with members and having the same understanding of those engagement initiatives. And then the outcomes of it, it's really, really difficult to see sometimes. It's what I refer to, the closing the feedback loop, which I'll talk about in a minute again. And understanding, you know, if I was involved in a committee hearing, what was the outcome of that? Even if it was that what I said was not actually it was not the end result, but was it taken into account? How was it taken into account? That sort of thing. And incredibly insular. So although, again, there's really brilliant parliamentary engagement teams out there, but still as institutions, they tend to be very insular for lots of reasons, in terms of often where they are geographically in a country, often by security reasons, and all sorts of other issues, namely the fact they have to be impartial also, which makes it difficult to actually engage with different types of issues. And that's a problem if you want to keep your relevance. Because if you want to keep your relevance, you have to be part of society. You can't be insular in that way. And more importantly, it really is a drop in the ocean. And sometimes it's frustrating because you're talking to parliamentary officials and they say, yeah, but if we do all these things, then trust will go up. I say, well, not really, because you've got the media, you've got all the other things, you've got scandals, it's just need one politician to do something. And so it is a drop in the ocean. And increasingly, I don't think it can be something that one institution does. It has to be a collective of institutions within the system to do something about it, including, obviously, civil society, including places like schools and universities. So let's look a little bit at the guides on citizen engagement for parliaments. I'm a bit lost with time. I don't know how I'm doing because I wrote something and then I didn't look at the clock. How much time?
Now you spoke for about 30 minutes, right?
Sorry?
You spoke for about 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. So I thought, having talked in a quite pessimistic way, I guess. I mean, for those of you who know me, I'm actually very, very optimistic. So this is quite pessimistic for me. I just thought I would bring here some examples of giving a sense of what parliaments are doing and where some of the innovative work is. None of these parliaments have got the magic wand. None of these parliaments is doing, really, really well on everything. This is just examples to give a sense of the possible things that can be done. And so this is a series I developed last year with the support from InterPares. That QR code takes you to the page of where you can find all the guides. And so we developed a suite of 8 guides, and they're all on different topics. And there's 2 sort of hierarchical, that go across. There's one on the principles of parliamentary public engagement, and then one on engaging underrepresented groups. And the other ones are mainly in specific areas like public consultations, education, etc. And the reason why we did that was exactly that idea of losing the relevance, but also to give to parliaments a sense of something based on research, but also with practical tips on things that can be done. But within that, we try to also establish sort of key concepts that are core to the idea of meaningful engagement. So in the guide on principles, we set a set of 8 principles that meaningful, purposeful engagement should have, and some very obvious things in there like inclusion, and openness and transparency. But actually the 3 that I'm most attached to are those 3. So one is the collaboration and empowerment. And this is very much this idea that parliaments can't do things on their own. They are not experts on everything, obviously, but often they don't necessarily think about that. So it's working with outside partners, outside partnerships. Integration coordination, this is about working within Parliament so that things are not disconnected, and then impact evaluation, evaluating what you're doing. Again, something that parliaments really don't do very much at all. And it's not the easiest thing to do neither, but it's really important to understand what works, what doesn't work. And the guides also include some of these core concepts that we're trying to communicate. So one is this idea of meaningful, which is very much applied to youth engagement. So there's a lot of youth engagement initiatives, but a lot of them are quite tokenistic, quite elitist, and sort of quite patronizing, really, thinking, just asking young people about youth issues rather than about asking, about everyday issues that affect everyone. They don't affect just one layer of the population. But other core concepts, closing the feedback loop. So this is something that I feel very strongly about, that if you have an involvement of some sort, that there should be a way of saying to citizens what has that led to. And this is not about reporting each individual input, but it's about having processes that recognize there's a way of communicating back to citizens. And then the idea of lived experiences, so trying to bring in evidence to Parliament, which is not just specialised bodies, but also the lived experience of individual citizens, particularly from seldom heard voices, which is not the easiest thing to do. And some parliaments are doing quite well. A lot of parliaments are just not doing it at all. And then the next few slides is just some examples of some that are trying to bring a range around all the types of activities, but also different areas of the world, basically. So this one here is an example. So the guys have got case studies all across them. This is an example from Ireland, and it's about what they've been doing about disability inclusion. And they've done some really interesting work around deaf communities, where instead of having just hiring in translators of sign language, they actually hired a team that not only does translation sign language, but actually act as a bridge with the sign language and the deaf communities. And out of that, they've done lots of things, like even developed a whole parliamentary glossary in sign language and many other things. So they got much more of a role rather than just translating. They represent a community, do the bridge with that community. Teacher training programs, they can be a really good way of amplifying that idea, what Parliament is for. And this 3 examples from, they're very different, but from Brazil, the UK, and Canada. But yeah, it's about training teachers who then can go to schools and talk about Parliament, and even maybe sort of train other people about democracy, etc. This is an example from New Zealand about youth reference group for young people. This is a group of young people who actually support and work with the clerk of the House on youth issues and how Parliament should engage with youth. I love this one, radio. We forget about radio. I don't know why. Increasingly, I really love radio amongst all the noise. But in many places, radio is just such a really easy, quick way of actually communicating to citizens. And some examples here from Zambia and Indonesia about using radio programs to talk about Parliament, but also to get views from listeners into Parliament and then taking those to MPs. Outreach programs, there's quite a few of these outreach programs now where the staff goes to the regions, goes to talk to people in their own communities. I couldn't do a talk about engagement without mentioning Brazil. Brazil is doing so many things, and one of the systems they have is this e-citizenship program where people can submit ideas for legislation, they can comment on hearings committees, they can do a variety of things, but they also go beyond that and then have interactive workshops with local schools and try to fit that into the draft legislation program. And now, again, because I couldn't do a talk of this on April 2026 without mentioning AI, they are using AI in a way where they can match the ideas from citizens to actually proposals that senators are working on themselves. So it's a really good way actually of trying to match the volume of information they get and trying to lead to outputs where the citizen's idea can be picked up again, put them in touch with the senator and develop a legislative proposal. And I've got an example here again on sort of outreach from Kenya. They're mashinani, where they go a whole week outside to the capital and work with local communities. And in Ghana, where they do amazing work with civil society, and they particularly target seldom heard voices like illiterate groups through their engagement activities. And last but not least, I could have put Brussels in here, but you know about Brussels, so I've brought the example of Scotland, institutionalising deliberation. They've got through a whole process. I can tell you more about that later if you want to. It's really interesting actually how they've done it to integrate that, and now it's part of the fabric of the Parliament. And finally, I'll just talk about this Parliament very quickly. Does anyone know where that is? Which Parliament this is? It's an amazing building, isn't it? No? Yes, yes, yes. It's the Welsh Parliament, Senate, Cameroon. So yeah, if you ever visit the UK, don't go and see Westminster, because that's just boring. Go to Wales, have a look at the Senate, and go to Edinburgh, Holyrood, and have a look at the Scottish Parliament. They're much more interesting institutions than Westminster. So I put here the Welsh Parliament just to give you an example of one parliament doing lots of different things. And it is a really interesting parliament in terms of how they're trying to do engagement. They have a brilliant youth parliament, which is consequential and diverse in terms of how they recruit. They specifically recruit from underrepresented type of groups of young people. They have a 2-year mandate. They work with the parliament, so there's lots of reasons why it's consequential. They have a committee, citizen engagement team, which is integrated with committees. So everyone in this team works with specific committees. So engagement is very much embedded in the practice of what committees do. They have a proactive approach to seldom heard voices, and they do monitoring of diversity of witnesses, including engaging public, and they take great care on closing the feedback loop. Now, is democracy in Wales amazing? Not necessarily, but they are doing all the right things, and they've did more and more of this. And if there was support beyond the bubble of Parliament, what Parliament is doing, then you start seeing really interesting impact. So some conclusions. Are parliaments able to stay relevant? There's clearly, as I hope you can see from all the examples I brought in here, there's clearly a huge expansion of lots of activities in this area of public engagement by parliaments. But it's still very uneven across countries. Some countries are, a beacon of innovation and things working, but in other areas there's not a lot. And actually, I'd say that Europe overall is not very innovative in relation to other areas of the globe in terms of innovations. It's mostly unimpactful in that you see the activities in there, but is it leading to actually change differences? We need far more, and we need far more meaningful activities. And we need an approach to engagement that takes into account that public engagement journey, that doesn't focus just on developing a website for doing an online consultation, but thinks of the overall picture around that. Who is going to get to that? Are they going to actually understand what it is all about? And that we need far more partnerships with other institutions. That includes government, includes schools, includes the media, but obviously civil society, very, very important, in that to keep that relevance. And it needs a far more pervasive presence within society. In our Reimagining Citizens' Engagement with Parliament chapter, we talk about a continuous relationship, which obviously is utopic. It couldn't really happen that. But it's about the idea that it's embedded in society and engagement is embedded in the mechanisms of Parliament. And that's me. That's done.
Cristina. Okay, now we open the floor for questions, comments, suggestions, whatnot.
Thank you. This was a very, very interesting talk. So I'm going to ask very naive questions because this is really not my field of study. And the first one is about dimension and center periphery. So when you mentioned parliaments that do particularly well in terms of inclusion, for example, having the youth parliament, you mentioned relatively small parliament that refer to relatively small places, Scotland, Wales, right? And I wonder, I mean, I'm Italian, it's a much more spread territory, and I always felt quite of a physical distance also from the parliament. It's not a place that is easily accessible for majority of people living in the country, and I'm thinking that probably in Spain, in France, must be somewhat the same thing. So I wonder whether dimension and the distance, so the center periphery, let's say, issue might play a role there in the ability of participating and also of reaching out. And I was wondering whether some European country experimented with, let's say, the same model of the US one. When you watch US series or US movie, you have this thing, I'm going to say to my representative, to my Senate representative, and it's really not something that I never heard of over here, right? So I know that when I vote in Italy for the Senate or even for the chamber, I elect somebody that is from a list from this territory, and then they get elected and they go there, and that's it. So there's, I forget their name.
Yeah.
I wonder if somebody ever experimented with the idea of, oh, one day a week I go back to the territory and I talk to people, for example. And if that yielded to any results, or if you think that it's feasible at all in a place like Europe.
Great questions. Sorry. No, go ahead. I really don't mind. I'm happy to have the next question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Cristina. I'm Tanya Verge, Senior Fellow at BrIAS at the moment. We met before with the Iberian Legislature's Routledge Handbook. I was wondering, well, two questions. One is, in your map and your widespread experience in the topic, public engagement tends to be conceived of more as organized groups interacting with Parliament, or in practice? What does it happen? It is more outreach to organized groups because it's easier to reach them and bring them into Parliament, or rather general public beyond schools and high schools, because this is a different type of audience. And my second question is, do these open Parliament, public engagement Parliament frameworks interact and fit into each other with the gender-sensitive Parliament framework, to some extent, at least?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go now, or?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah?
Now we go to a second round.
Okay. Great questions. So, yeah, I think there's definitely something there about the distance, for sure, in lots of different ways. One of them is just geographical, and the pure distance that it might take to people to go to the capital where maybe the national parliament is, but also in question of identity coming in there, where people are, where their identity feel like, and how might they feel in relation to the centre. So I know a little bit about Italy, but I don't know a lot. But I can see that happening, being very clear, say, between the Mezzogiorno and Rome, and thinking, having specific assumptions what the elite in Rome would be. The same thing in the UK. So people who live, in Aberdeen in Scotland, they've got very specific views about Westminster. So it's more natural to link to connect to the idea of a Scottish Parliament. And there's also the fact that being, in practical terms, being small, it's easier to do things. It's easier to contact communities. It's easier to travel. It's easier to convince the MPs to go there. If you are in a huge country, like in Australia, it's much more difficult to do. There are examples, and actually on that point, I'd say there's a lot of subnational parliaments that are really, really innovative in what they do. And I think partly it's also because they are more able to test things out. Often national parliaments are much more risk averse because they're more traditional, they've been there for a longer time often, and they don't test things out necessarily, whereas subnational parliaments are more relaxed about testing things. And if you don't test things, then you don't really know what works. So there's also a bit of that. There are examples, though, of places like the Parliament of South Australia, and their remit is actually huge. They've got huge distances, and obviously they use digital a lot because that's one way of engaging with those communities. But they also do things like outreach, and they'll go a whole week, say, to a particular area and do lots of activities locally. Another example of that is the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands, it's lots of different islands. It's very, very difficult for people in the localities to come to the capital. And so they go a whole week there, and they do, during the day they work with schools, in the evening they work with other groups. So there's different strategies that parliaments are doing, and there's no reason why national parliaments should be doing that. But often I think comes from innovation. But the distance definitely plays a role in that. And the idea of one day a week to join territory to talk, yes, definitely. And you actually see this again, I think in Europe, there's not actually many examples. There's some good examples. So there's things like in Estonia, there's some really interesting activity there. But and you know, Scotland does this thing with a speaker where they go a whole week to a community and work in there. But in Latin America, you see a lot of that. So in Latin America, you see sort of dedicated days where people go to the local communities. Now, does everyone know about that? That's the issue. You know, when they do that, do they go and talk just with their own groups they will talk to? And it's more how they do it, the issue. But definitely the idea of MPs going one day a week. I mean, in the UK, they have to do that because otherwise they would just not be elected. So in the UK, it's part of the culture. But in other places, definitely something that would be very useful, or even just a committee going to a community. And there's examples of that in other parliaments. Organised groups or general public, that's where the usual suspects comes in. So if you don't do anything about it, it tends to be organised groups. Not just organised groups, but the ones with lots of resources, you know, the big groups. So if you want to hear from the small community charity groups, from the ones that maybe more grassroots level, then you need more to explicitly reach out to those and give them a reason to get engaged. But if you don't do anything about it, then it tends to be the organised groups, and it tends to be the ones that are more well established. So there's a lot of work in doing that area. How does the open framework and gender-sensitive parliament framework link together? I think they are intimately linked, actually, because a key part of engagement is very much about inclusion. It's about people feel that they are going to be listened to and they are being taken seriously. And so whatever their characteristics may be, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, or whatever that we're thinking about in a particular moment, they are really important. And if you have a public engagement strategy in the parliament, but you don't take that into account, then you're not doing it very well. So they are very much intertwined, I think.
Thank you, Cristina. Very, very interesting presentation again. So thank you. Thanks a lot for that. I have a question about accountability, account giving. That was an eye-opener for me during your talk today, because I'm very concerned with democratic accountability in the way we organize our democracies today. There's a lot of stress on voice and giving input, but there's, like this accountability phase is very much neglected. And so you opened my eyes today on how parliaments as institutions actually have a really important role to play vis-a-vis the people, citizens, the public in general. Mm-hmm. Because MPs hold members of government to account, and MPs themselves are held to account in the media, in TV studios, sometimes an individual interview in a newspaper. But you opened our eyes to how parliaments as institutions actually can also do this at a more collective level. So my question is, can you tell a bit more on that? And also, for me, accountability is something different than feedback. Accountability has a way more critical dimension to it. It's about building critical trust in society. And I think this ties into also this idea of empowerment and resilience way more. But yet you use the word feedback and closing the feedback loop. And I was wondering, is there, do you have a reason for why you use that language rather than democratic accountability, account giving, etc., etc.? So one part of the question is, can you tell a bit more? Because I think this is fascinating. This is for me really an aha moment. And then these conceptual choices that you make.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question is somewhat related to Karen's question, so it's nice that they come together. So you talked a lot about how parliaments should engage with the public, for example, by bringing lived experiences. But of course, elected representatives also ought to do so, right? And they organize themselves into parties. And this left me wondering a bit, like, if they both have this job, how should they do this job differently? And in what ways is it the same job? So how does it relate? That's my question. Thank you.
Another great question. Do I reply? No. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. You talked about that there is a lot of noise in the public sphere and that parliaments become only one voice and then often also a distant voice among many. Do you think that parliaments should then be active on platforms that other influencers are active on? So I say platforms like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, to make their message more approachable. But then I think you have also the danger that the message becomes too simple or too, how do we say it, not deep enough, that it loses context. So I think it's a difficult, difficult decision to make, how to be more approachable, how to be more open and visible to the public, but not lose context and not lose depth to the work that the parliament does. So I don't know how you see that parliaments can be more approachable, more visible to the general public, to the youth, but not lose their context.
Lots of great questions. Shall I reply now, Sylvia? Yes, so accountability, really good question. It's interesting because you link to the closing the feedback loop, and to me they're separate things. So that's really interesting that you come to me that from that perspective. And obviously they are related. I totally see that they are related. So in terms of that accountability and that collective voice of parliaments, I think it's very much about the systems in place and that the institution has to be more than the parties. So obviously the parties are absolute, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The parties, MPs, they're all absolutely essential, and there's no questioning in there. But within the institution, you need to have the processes, the systems to make sure that you're doing those linkages between citizens and governance, and that's the accountability link. Because politicians, they come and go. The institution is always there, hopefully. The parliamentary staff is always there. The process is always there. And so part of that resilience, I think, is about having systems in place that can do that connection regardless of comes in and goes. So doing the bridge to your question about parties, I really like the way you've put that. Do they both need to do the same job? I suppose in some ways they do, but it's also about the type of institution. And the institution, obviously Parliament, it's a bit of a schizophrenic position in that they need to do lots of things, but they can't do it without the parties, they can't do it with the MPs. Obviously, they need to do with those. And a really good example that came to my mind as you were saying that was the German Bundestag's experiment with deliberative democracy. Don't know if you know anything about that. So they brought in a program of bringing in citizen assemblies because it was very much on the SPD program. It was very much linked to that party, to that program, to what the government wanted to do. And that, it's not the situation anymore. And so now there's not the will there. And the processes themselves, the systems themselves were not strongly enough. They're not embedded in the institution. So the party, the ideology, the transitory nature of that accountability link, that's what's dominated in there. And that's partly why the Scottish Parliament approach is so interesting. So what they've done is they've gone through a process which is much longer, really, and they did a citizen assembly themselves to figure out how to develop those processes, work with different MPs from different parties, not just those in government, and develop process, and then at the end came back. And this is over a period of like 2 years doing all of this, and then came back at the end with a proposal which they called the blueprint, which members themselves voted in the chamber and approved, and it's part of the system now, almost like of the rules of procedure for the next parliament to come. So we're having Scottish Parliament elections next week. Oh my goodness, it's happening next week. And I don't know if you know about the politics in the UK, but do you know about Nigel Farage's party, Reform Party?
I wish I didn't know.
Yes, so do I, believe me. I actually live in an area where our mayor is from Reform. Anyway, Reform is expected to do really well. So that will be interesting to see how a parliament, such as Scottish Parliament, has brought in something which is quite progressive, really, quite, forward-looking in terms of having this institutionalized, which from an academic point of view, it looks like they've done all the right things to do exactly those collective systems of accountability, which sort of perform their duty regardless of, who comes in, who goes, or crisis or whatever it may be. But we'll see. Maybe I'll be here 2 years' time and say, no, actually, even that doesn't work. So we can't do that. We have to do something else. And I'll come back to so in terms of how the parties fit into this, is that parliaments obviously have to work with the parties. It has to be, it can't be a parallel process. And sometimes it is a parallel process. Sometimes because parliamentary staff, they need to be impartial, they need to be neutral. They can't talk about politics, but people engage through politics, through issues. And if you don't involve parties, if you don't involve the MPs themselves, then you're not really engaging them into politics. You're just doing a tick-box exercise of, okay, they know, how many readings a law has. They know what committees do, but they don't really engage, relate to it. And coming back to the closing the feedback loop. So the closing feedback loop, I see it as more of an individual thing. For the actual citizens themselves, they feel that they've been listened to. So it's about, and obviously, I would see that as one of the elements of that broader collective accountability system. So one of the elements in there would be that there is a mechanism of closing the feedback loop so that individuals feel that they've been listened to, whatever way. Does that answer the question? Yeah. And then, that's the question that most parliamentary staff really want to know. And the best way to illustrate that is by thinking of, do you do TikTok or do you not do TikTok? A lot of parliaments stay away from TikTok. The Brazilian parliament obviously has been on TikTok for years now. And I think it's about... basically, parliaments have to use all mechanisms available. And even using all mechanisms available, it's not enough. So they might use TikTok, and sort of more young people might follow it. But they're still very likely to be, engaged young people. I've got 3 sons. I can't see any of them following any social media of any parliament. And they are, they're the sons of a politics professor. If it's to do with their music that they're interested, then they'll follow. So I think what parliaments need to do is to actually understand that, go where the people are, where their interests are, and talk to them in those languages. So yeah, they can have all those social media accounts and all of that, but that's not going to do a lot. What it's going to do is going to actually to the community groups, or youth groups, or whatever it is, or discussing something that people really care about, and invite young people, elderly people, whoever they may be, and actually give them a proper, meaningful opportunity to say what they want to say on those topics. The Brazilian Congress TikTok is quite funny, though.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I had a question, especially on the about balance between engagement and quality.
Engagement and
quality.
Quality.
Yeah, of your communication. Because we've seen in France that there is a study about the speaking time of MPs in the French national parliamentary, and that time has been divided by 2. Over the course of 10 years, because they can make clips out of them and put it on Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah.
So, but this kind of interaction get more views than somebody that's speaking for 5, 10 or 50 minutes with a lot of context, a lot of information, and so a lot of quality. And so I've been asking myself, and also because I'm in the media in Belgium, in the French-speaking part of Belgium, where we get every bill that's been voted or voted down, and we have an infography. I don't know how you say it, a visualization, and every dot is green or yellow or red, and you see what party voted, and slide 2 is explanation, slide 3 is explanation. And most of the time, the first slide with the visualization is taken over by some parties, and they point their fingers at other parties, like, look, they didn't vote that, and they skip the second and third and the fourth slide with all the explanation. So my question is, how do you make sure that your communication has a lot of engagements? Because I think social media is really important in engagement today, without losing the quality of it. So how's the balance, and is it worth it to lose some quality to gain some engagement?
Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, I've been thinking about it. I'm a student. You've been a researcher about it, so I think you're more qualified than me.
Yeah.
I still prefer doing some quality, even though, and I've seen in the media that I've been part of, when we're doing a lot of quality posts, we get like 300 likes, and when we do something a bit more performative, and then we get like 10,000 likes, and it performs good, and I'm happy and stuff, but I'm not so happy because, you know, there is no quality to it. It's just a propaganda, then it's not a real information.
Great question. Answer now, or do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, thank you for a very engaging talk, Cristina. I have 2 questions. The first one is about your general criterion for measuring the quality of engagement. It's like you mentioned that engagement for you is essentially about empowerment, right? And I fully agree with that. But I might have a bit of a more critical question, like how can parliaments empower citizens when parliaments themselves have lost quite a lot of power to government, to parties, and especially because there is this perception amongst parliaments and MPs especially that giving away or empowering citizens is about giving away power from politicians to the citizens themselves, right? So how can we convince MPs to do these types of things, given the context in which they already have lost quite a lot of power? And then maybe a second question is, use parliaments maybe a bit generically in the presentation, but within parliaments you have MPs, elected politicians, and then you have the parliamentary staff. So what would be, in terms of public engagement, what would be like the division of labor between them? Like, what would the MPs have to do? What would the parliamentary staff have to do to function optimally?
Sorry, another question. At a certain point, you said something that sounded beautifully English to me, right? There is the parliament, right? There is the institution, and the institution stays as the rest goes, right? And then I was starting thinking about this multi-layer structure. There is the parliament. There are, now Didier actually mentioned things that I didn't even think about. The people that work in the parliament, the parties are embedded in the parliament. And at the end of this embedding structure, there are people, right? So in the end, the institution, even if so temporarily, is made by people. And I had this incredibly depressing thought that I'm just asking you to wipe off now of the Italian parliament. And I think that one of the problems, at a certain point, when you look at correlation between, you know, the typical trust scale, so trust in parliament and trust with politician. And normally people trust parliaments more than politician, but actually there is a correlation because it's really difficult for the average citizen to understand differences there. And I was wondering, I really think that what you're presenting and what parliaments try to do with engagement is fantastic. And I was thinking, okay, social media, okay. But when I think about the 200 scandals that I heard of in the last 2 months related to people sitting in parliament now in my country, that, how can I say this? I'm sophisticated enough to make the difference between the institution and the person.
Mm-hmm.
And still, right, for me, it's this parliament I don't trust.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, do you think that I understand you specifically study engagement, but would engagement be more appreciated or valued or even more embraced if there was higher trust in the people sitting in the parliament?
Mm-hmm.
And whether you think that we should have a code of conduct, or whether having a stricter idea of when you should resign from being parliamentary would help with this.
Yeah.
Because normally it's the opposite, right? They are protected. I understand all the reasons for this, but it creates a lot of distrust in the population.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you think that independently for everything, for the parliament as an institution, this would help.
Yeah. Cool. And I've just realized I didn't address earlier the idea of that feedback is not just feedback. There has to be critical trust that you mentioned earlier, Karen. And yeah, I totally believe in that there needs to be, the processes need to be robust enough to endure that critique. And when I talk about closing the feedback loop, it really is that feeling of being listened to and having a sense for, I understand where it's gone. So I just saw my comment in there, and I realized, I didn't mention that. So, yes, coming back to social media and quality, in your question, it made me think, sort of related to the previous question, it made me think of a picture. Unfortunately, I don't have it here to show it to you, but it made me think of Brazilian members of parliament sort of doing speeches, not doing the speech on the stage, actually being just in the chamber by their seat, not sitting down, standing up, and YouTubing, and just talking to their citizens directly. And I've got a great picture of that. And it's not that difficult to find. If you go on Google and Google it, you'll find it, because it happens every day, where people are just talking directly to the citizens, and what people are listening to, it's not necessarily actually the speeches in there. In fact, the first time I went to the chamber of the Brazilian Congress, I thought, oh my word, what's happening here? Because it's like a market. It's so noisy, and whoever's doing the speeches, they're not being listened to, because everyone else is talking between themselves and doing their business of exchange, and now they're actually talking directly. And I think that's sort of an extreme situation of what you're talking about in there, in that the official, the quality, the deliberation is not necessarily happening, because maybe the members don't feel they actually need to do that, because the citizens don't care about that. Let's just communicate to them, straight to them, and say what I think they need to listen to. And I think that photo terrifies me, because I think that's really dangerous, because then it just increases the noise within the institution even more so. And increasingly, you do see that, in the UK, the chamber is very, very sort of well-behaved in a very British way. But increasingly, that's what MPs are doing. They're just doing the clips to then put in their own social media and communicate. And as with everything, I think it's about the balance. So obviously, the more we think about how to communicate, the more you simplify the information. But then it's about also giving access to the real information. And there's a process of translation of that, which might be, it's not necessarily translation in languages like from English to French or whatever. It's translation in terms of simplifying what are the key messages of this. And some parliaments and some party groups, some MPs are really good at doing that. Others do that in a very sensational way, because that works well for them. So I think it's a real issue, losing that quality of the deliberation. And you see that particularly with speeches in chamber. I don't know if it's how it is in Belgium, whether you see that phenomenon as much, but in the UK you definitely see that. In Brazil you've been seeing that for a long time. In Portugal you see that so much at the moment. It's so scary, because you wouldn't a few years ago. And actually I think a lot of that makes some of the other parliamentary spaces more important, like committee work. So I don't know how much you know about parliaments, but actually a lot of the more valuable work is done in committees because it's more detailed, more in deliberation, more in depth, where the quality is. And increasingly, the chamber maybe is more for talking to outside, which is problematic when you're supposed to be having a debate. If I can do a parenthesis here, in the UK Parliament, there's a really interesting situation in that we have two parallel chambers. So we have the main chamber that you probably recognise from TV, and then we have something called Westminster Hall. So Westminster Hall, it's a chamber that they do Westminster Hall debates. They've been doing that since 1999, and they developed this on the basis of something that the Australian Parliament has. Australian Parliament has something similar. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen a photo of Westminster Hall, but Westminster Hall, the tables, the chairs are in a horseshoe shape, because the main chamber is adversarial, and it's very much adversarial, debate in the UK Parliament. But the Westminster Hall is a horseshoe like that. It's much smaller, and the public gallery is just there. And it's a hall that's only there for backbenchers. You know this concept of backbenchers? So they're not the party leaders, they're just people, backbenchers. And I've been doing some interesting research with Louise Thompson from Manchester University about the quality of debate, exactly, between the two chambers, and about which ones are actually leading to facilitating a better communication to the issues, not only communication to citizens, but to the issues that citizens are bringing in. And we're seeing interesting things, how MPs are using Westminster Hall, which is less visible. The media knows about it, but doesn't really know about it. Most people don't know about it. But they're using Westminster Hall to actually having a more direct conversation with ministers and to resolve issues. So we see members raising to set the agenda on the main chamber, because they're talking to the media there, and then they focus on something specific, they come for the Westminster Hall. And that's really interesting, but not all parliaments have two chambers, but they have committees, and so maybe sometimes the way that quality is. But there is a lot of work to be done in terms of translation of ideas to the public, and you mentioned infographics, videos, social media is also a way to do it, but yeah, it's very easily, it gets into something which has no context in it whatsoever, which is then quite difficult, isn't it? But then also, if the parliamentary institution is quite good at explaining what's going on, then maybe that's not so much of an issue, because then you can go somewhere else and get all the context. Empowerment. Do you need to convince the MPs because they've lost lots of power already? That's often one of the main problems. And it's one of the main problems that staff will say to me in research is, that's all very well, but I need to have the members, MPs, deputies on board, and they will not do this because they think it's taking the power away from them. However, I also hear from parliamentary staff that when they manage to involve the members and they see the value of doing their work better, because it should be about helping MPs, actually, or deputies, to do their job better, to do better scrutiny, to understand the issues, and to do better laws. And when they get that, they actually are on board. And that's that process that I described very badly and very quickly. In Scotland, that's what they did. So now they have members. Well, now, let's see what happens next week. Up to now, they're having members who actually now understand what a mini panel is and in what ways can help them, or understand something else about how working with the community and doing an outreach session, understand why that's valuable for their work, and approaching the participation community team and asking them to work with them. So it's very much a question of bringing them on board. But I suspect with a new parliament, a huge intake of new people, you have to do the work again. And who does the job? MPs or the staff? It definitely needs to be both of them. And again, I did a study a few years ago on a engagement opportunity. This is really a long time ago, where not many people knew what they were doing, and the staff did an excellent job of trying to bring in input of what people thought of this bill, Children's and Family Bill. Great testimonies, all of that, but one, the citizens had no idea what happened to it. Coming back to the closing the feedback loop, they sent an input online and they didn't even know what happened after, not even an email, by the way, we have looked at this bill now. More importantly, the MPs had no idea about it, or very little, and so they didn't use it. So obviously the staff needs to do a lot of the work, and the staff needs to be the expertise. MPs can't be experts on doing engagement, just they can't be experts on organising meetings, that sort of thing. But MPs definitely need to be on board. And not just MPs, again, depending on the system, if MPs have staff themselves, then those staff for MPs are really, really important to be on board. And often they're actually the issue, because you can't get to the MP unless you talk to their staff. So they both need to do it, and you can't really do separately. People, Italian Parliament, Code of Conduct, and the people. It actually made me think, your question made me think of two different types of people. I mean, everyone is just people, isn't it? It's not types of people, but coming back to the end of your question about the codes of conduct and the behaviour of MPs, that is definitely really important. It's so important because that's what sustains the legitimacy of a system. It's one of the key rules of why we accept the system, is that we have a shared understanding what is a code of conduct, what is doing politics properly, listening to other people, being declaring your interests or whatever it may be. So that it should be part of the fabric of a parliament in doing so. So it should definitely be there. But your question also made me think of something else, which I don't think is at all what you were asking, but if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about it, which is about the people, and coming back to Didier's question about the staff. And one thing I found interesting is that I did some focus groups 2 years ago with people who were involved in petitions. And they did petitions, went through the whole process, and they didn't really have a feeling that there was staff behind the systems, because people, when they look at the parliament, they just see the politicians. And it was in the instances where they were contacted by staff, they thought, well, for one, they thought, oh, actually someone has read my email, someone is actually going to reply, closing the feedback loop again. But two, actually, that person is called Emma. I know Emmas. It suddenly feels like more, it feels more, it demystifies that distance of the institution, because people will look at Parliament as a collective institution, and it's really difficult to actually relate to that. And that relatability, you do it through people, through connections. And a very simple thing to do is for staff to say, actually, we're here. We are normal people. We support all politicians from Reform to Greens, and we just really want to help you to say what you want to say, and for them to listen to that. And it's interesting how in those focus groups, the element of the staff, that they were just normal people, was so important to them to think, actually, it's not just this big blob thing. There are people who work there and who actually, they're quite nice, and they have children like I do, and that sort of thing makes those connections. I think that was it.
No, the other question is not necessarily the last question, but the next question, yes.
Thank you very much. My question is related to the answer you gave about the Brazilian chamber. Now, in Ghana, in 2018, we did a study, and I was shocked to know that 80% of Ghanaians didn't care about what goes on in the Ghanaian parliament. Yeah. They didn't care. And when we just supposed to check the 20% who cared, we checked their educational level and checked their interest. And interestingly, they were connected to parliament in one way or the other. But apart from that, all those we interviewed, they didn't care about what goes on in parliament. So I just want to better we ask them, what are you interested in? Oh, they want to see their MP engage with their constituents. They want to see their MPs building some development projects. They want to see the MPs doing A, B, C, D. I just want to find out from you, is it an outlier, or is it around the world people are not too much keen about what goes on in the chamber, or is the Ghanaian case is an outlier? Thank you.
Hi, Cristina. So you mentioned before, and I think it's a key important element of public engagement and parliaments and citizens' relationship, it's how difficult it is for layman citizens to understand, to follow parliamentary politics, the language of parliamentary politics, the language of politics, and the procedures as well. And we don't have much evidence, but when we measure readability of parliamentary speeches, readability of the content on parliamentary websites, the scores tell us that it's really difficult for citizens to understand. We used to have a really good question in the European Social Survey about how difficult it is to follow politics and to understand. We don't have it anymore, but it was the same evidence that it's really difficult for the majority of citizens. And as you know, this was one of the dimensions we included in the focus groups of my project. And surprisingly to me, I mean, my expectation when we asked during the sessions of focus groups if it was easy or difficult to follow what happens with the Portuguese parliament and the language used and so on, a lot of the answers, and of course there are nuances here and we are still processing the data, but a lot of the answers was, no, it's quite easy these days because it's quite simple and vulgar because of the radical rights. Because they change everything and the language is much more simpler, it's much more accessible in a way that's not good in the way they portray. But it's a new element, I think. So you mentioned before the composition of parliament that of course impacts what parliaments collectively, institutionally, they do in terms of public engagement, but besides that, there is this other elements, perhaps more subtle, that I don't know if this is very specific to a parliament where the radical right became so relevant and so vocal as it happens with the Portuguese parliament. We used to be an exception. We are not anymore. I don't know if that's very specific to that case or other parliaments where the radical right are so vocal, but I think it's a new element that's very interesting that could also interplays in the relationships citizens have and the perceptions and the images they have with parliament. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting question. Are you?
I also have a question, but I don't know if there are other questions first. Somebody? Okay, shall I ask or do you want to go
No,
first?
that's fine, yeah.
Okay, so also thank you again, Cristina, very, very interesting. My first question is about the article that you referred to also in the beginning, and an article that I've read many times because I think it's so fascinating. So this evolution of parliaments, going from gentlemen's parliaments to representative parliaments to mediator parliaments. And you say now, well, 10 years later, I'm not sure anymore about what's going on with the mediator parliament. So what is, according to you, then the future of parliaments? Like, where are we going now? What is the next stage or step in this process? And second, you have some examples about parliaments going to local communities. And I think that's really fascinating. Like the idea that you come out of these buildings the parliamentary buildings that are typically, of course, open to the public. You can go there, but feel very close to many people. And then you make the decision. We go to them. We go outside these buildings and we go to the local communities. I don't know that you explained to us that studies of impact are quite scarce yet. But do you have any ideas of the impact of these kind of initiatives? Because I think it also links to Karen's work on democratic listening. That might be also said like a positive impact, but I can also imagine that parliaments going to local communities might also kind of be somewhat in conflict with what local governments are trying to do or willing to do, or how they see that their power gets, I don't know, limited a bit by the national parliament going to the local, or the regional parliament going to the local level. So these are my two questions.
Great, thank you. So starting with the survey in Ghana, I'd say that's not an outlier at all, I'm afraid. I think usually most people don't really know much about Parliament. In most cases, people confuse Parliament with government anyway. They think you talk about Parliament, but they're thinking of government, and most people don't necessarily relate to it. When they relate to it is when Parliament is seen as a symbol of democracy. So if it's a new democracy and that's still fresh in people's minds, then Parliament is that symbol of democracy. So people understand that and trust that because it's a protector of democracy. It's like a guarantor of democracy. But I'd say most people can't really relate to it don't necessarily trust because they don't trust politicians in general. What you see is that people, and it was mentioned earlier, that they tend to trust more politicians from their own constituencies when that's the case, rather than a global collective of politicians. And also, yeah, to most people, because they're not necessarily, they're listening to the media maybe, they've got their own lives, they do their things, and why would they know about Parliament? Normal people they get on with their lives unless, in school is a really important part, or unless in the media is a really important part. So there needs to be reasons for people to have that image of Parliament more embedded in their lives. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's an outlier. In Ghana, actually, they've introduced a new department of public engagement. So they're doing a lot of work in this area, and really interesting work. So it's a case study that I'm quite keen to follow. Layman understanding and radical right. Yes. Really tricky, because the reason why Chega, Ventura, Nigel Farage are so popular, one of the reasons, many reasons, is obviously they're talking a language people understand. Take Nigel Farage out of the picture, take Ventura out of the picture. What is Chega? What is reform? And it's that ability to communicate and simplify languages, it's populism, isn't it? That's one of the definitions of populism, is simplifying things and reducing the complexity of it. I don't think it's just a radical right. I think you'll see that on the radical left, or we're seeing something similar happening now in the UK with the Green Party, which has also become very popular because, again, they are able to communicate in a clear way, in a way that resonates with people. In this case, actually mainly a young population. But we've seen it mainly from the radical right. And I think that's where it becomes really difficult for parliaments to do, because parliaments they need to develop the expertise, the ability to communicate like someone like André Ventura. And they're well away from that for lots of reasons, because they're also selling a much more difficult product. And I hate this language, so please don't believe that. I don't think I think of selling a product, but it's this idea of how to communicate about an institution that is complex in a world where complexity is not really liked. We increasingly simplify things. Increasingly also we want quick decisions. We don't understand that it takes time for policy to go through for lots of different reasons. So I think it's a real challenge, and it becomes a particular challenge when those particular groups of people or politicians, they accuse each other. And often actually the worst people to defend Parliament are politicians themselves, because they'll be criticising other politicians, and then you see all of that happening, and then you think, okay, where's the institution? And then the institution is not really there because they can't interfere, and that sort of thing. So I think it's a real problem. And I'd hope that communication teams in parliaments would learn from some of that. And some of them do. One of the problems in parliaments is that people who work in the area of, say, social media, communications, all of that, they can get much better jobs, much better paid outside Parliament than in Parliament. So often you see people coming in with great ideas, amazing ideas, and they'll last a year or two, and then they'll go to the private sector. So that's another issue. Future. I'm not there yet. I'm still on the mediator. So I'm still giving the mediator a try. And I think it has to be that role, because if it's not that role, then it's the irrelevant Parliament. I don't want the irrelevant Parliament. If that happens, I hope it's not when I'm still around. Someone else can write about the irrelevant Parliament. I still want to talk about the mediator Parliament and just think about how parliaments can strengthen their systems, mechanisms, and capacity to play a role as mediators, because at the moment, they're really not very much doing that. And I think a lot of this is very new. Some parliaments, like Parliament of Ghana, they've only introduced the Department of Public Engagement a few years ago, and a lot of parliaments don't even have that yet, or they're still figuring out how to do it. So I think it's all very new, and we're still beginning of the century, aren't we? We are. So there's still time. Let's hope we don't get to the irrelevant Parliament. Impact of outreach. No. Unfortunately not. I'd love to do that research. I have tried to get funding for that a few times, but as you know, funding for research in Parliament is not the easiest thing to get. There's sort of anecdotal evidence, and I have interviewed staff who go on to those trips, and the pure pleasure they have on that, but also from the perspective of MPs, of understanding, actually having that click moment, of really understanding, that's why this is a problem, that's why this is an issue. I'm thinking, for instance, a committee in Westminster, UK Parliament, that was looking at fishing and fishing quotas and that sort of thing. And they actually went to Scotland and did an outreach session there with fishermen. And suddenly, just being there, not only was important for the fishermen themselves, but it was important for the MPs themselves to actually understand what the real issues, and to understand the distance that the fishermen felt in relation to Westminster. And in terms of local governments being questioned, I don't know, but I've never seen that. And I think partly it's because really parliaments don't have a lot of power. So I don't think any government feels threatened by parliaments. So you see sort of sometimes, not conflict, but questioning, say, from the parliamentary teams of the Scottish Parliament and the parliamentary teams from Westminster, if they're doing outreach, actually. So in the UK Parliament, they have a system of outreach officers. So they have an officer for different regions across the whole of the country, including for Scotland, for Wales, Northern Ireland. And in there's a bit of an overlap with what the people in the devolved parliaments do. But they tend to work quite collaboratively, and they sort of reinforce each other's messages, really. Because Westminster is reinforcing the fact that we don't have power in education. The people of Scottish Parliament say, well, we have the power in education. So I don't think it's an issue. And I think local governments, they can care less. They just don't really notice it. But in terms of the impact, I think it is really powerful. And I just wanted to give an example, because I mentioned them earlier, but I didn't give this example, of the sort of innovations people are doing. So it's powerful that you go there and that people feel, actually, someone in Westminster, or the capital, main parliament, came to see us, and that's humbling in itself. But I guess what you lose is a sense of being in the space, which is also important, the actual space. Actually, one of the guys is all about the space. And one of my favorite examples, and it's just a little thing, but the outreach team in South Australia, when they go and do the outreach activities in schools, they take these floor mats and props, which sort of reproduce the chamber in the South Australian Parliament, and the kids absolutely love it, and they take robes and things like that, and they try to reproduce the Parliament in there. And obviously it's not the same as being in the building, but it sort of brings that space to them and the symbolism of that space. And so there's a variety of ways in which the outreach can be done. It's about looking at the communities, but it's also about taking the Parliament to the communities in whatever form. And some of that might be by the speaker. So there's some programmes which involve taking the speaker or taking a committee, and that's another way of taking the Parliament to the people.
Right. Any other questions? Yes. Two more.
I have another question about local engagement and accessibility. So in Belgium, there is a long time debate about double mandate. So double mandate is that you are also MP, but also a mayor. And the debates have been around for a long time now, and I personally always have been against, because for me it's too much responsibility for one person and too much of a salary also. But I've been speaking with a MP that's also a mayor, and told me that in his view that's super important to be a mayor when you're an MP, because when he's going back to his town in the weekends or during the week, everybody knows where to find him. That could be in the town's hall or at the local party, but everybody knows him and everybody knows where he is. So when somebody of this town have a question, they could easily find him and ask a question about the national parliament. And then I asked myself, maybe it's not about being locally engaged, maybe it's more about accessibility, because before, till the 20th century, we had the cafe culture where a lot of MPs went to the cafe and they could talk to everybody, and I'm putting that between, I don't know how to say it, but not actually everybody, because it was accessible to an elite group.
Yeah.
But the question is more about accessibility. How do we, normal people, have access to MP? How can we know where to find them, and how can we ask them questions, and how does that reinforce engagement?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here and facing all our questions. Related to what you talked about earlier about some parliaments with certain institutional settings or being in regions where there's greater distances to cover, being better at engagement, I was wondering if there's certain topics that are easier for engagement, and in what way is it potentially connected to like issue salience and polarization, or like more polarized topics easier, or maybe because they're polarized harder to use as kind of a carrier of engagement. And then you said a lot of parliaments engage a lot with the youth. Do you think that's because it's particularly effective? Or is it just something that everybody agrees on the same way, like everyone's always for education, no one's against education, so everyone's for youth engagement?
Great, thank you. Such amazing questions. You did say yesterday there would be lots of good questions, and it's very much true. Local engagement, accessibility, and the dual mandates. Yeah, there's the same thing in France, isn't it? I think they've done some restrictions in France about this now. Used to also be very similar in Portugal. And to the response of that MP that you talked to, I think it's more of a reflection of the fact that maybe the national MPs don't have proper structures locally to support that relationship. If they did, then they wouldn't need to be a mayor also to be well known. They would be in the community. And obviously that depends from culture to culture, from electoral system to electoral system. So in the UK, the fourth of that MP will not be in a constituency on a Friday. In fact, Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday is just unthinkable. You know, that MP would not last very long. They really need to be there. But even there, you'll find people saying, how can I access my MP when actually all MPs have got an office in their constituency? They all have constituency surgeries. So surgeries is like a time for when people can come and talk to the MPs. They'll be at the school fete, they'll be at the market, there'll be all sorts of other things. But it's about embedding that presence in the community and not just around the MP's activity, and about having those connections with the local youth groups, or the local charities, but also the local schools, the local newspapers, and it's sort of about developing those networks and having a presence locally. Now, not all the cultures have that, not all the systems have the resources for that, because an MP, you know, the fact that MPs in the UK have that is because they have the funding to do that. So if you don't have the funding, then it's more difficult to do. So there's a range of ways parliaments have developed that. So for instance, in South Africa, they've actually developed a program where they have parliament constituency offices in constituencies. So they're not MPs' offices, they are constituency offices from the parliament, and people can go there and ask questions about anything to do with the political system or to the MPs. So that's one way, but that again, it demands resources from the parliament. But any of these things demand resources, investment. Even if the resource is time, you need to think it through. And I really like the idea of the cafe culture, but although, as you say, probably wouldn't be, you know, if you're from a vulnerable group, you probably wouldn't feel comfortable to go to that, so you need a different type of space. So it tends to be about having multi-pronged approaches. Some of them might be digital, some of them might be in person, some of them will be working with intermediaries like community organisation groups who can make those bridges. But yeah, I think sometimes that dual mandate culture reflects more the fact that the national MPs don't necessarily have the culture, the structures to do those connections locally. So yeah, the accessibility is really important. But accessibility will emerge, if there's a social media presence, if there's a presence locally, etc. Certain topics, are they easier to do that engagement? Definitely, absolutely, definitely. And the way to, so in the topics that are more difficult is where the staff sort of completely stands aside and let the MPs completely do the job. But even that, it's quite difficult. So in the UK, for instance, there's a lot of debates around transgender rights. For instance, that's an issue that parliamentary staff would class as toxic, and they'll go nowhere near that. Having said that, the Scottish Parliament had a huge bill on the topic and did a huge series of engagement on that topic. But it was very, very difficult. It was very polarising, very, very difficult to undertake. But that's where having the MPs on board is so important, because the MPs, they can talk of their convictions, they can talk about their views, and if you have MPs on opposing sides, that's fine, that's politics. I think sometimes one of the things we're missing is that we've lost the understanding that politics is about discussion, about different views, and coming to agreements to move the life forward, but it's not about people all thinking the same way. People have different views. And so the role of staff can be a bit problematic in some topics. I do a lot of things with the petitions. I know the petitions team very well in the UK Parliament, and I know when they'll do public engagement, they'll be careful about what sort of topics they'll do exactly because of that. So some of them can be quite tricky to process. And in terms of youth, I'd say there's some really good examples of youth engagement. There's loads more of examples which they're just a gimmick, really. They're nice. And parliaments are aware, we need to do something for the youth, so let's do something for the youth. And it looks good, take some photos, etc. But it doesn't necessarily mean a lot in terms of actual engagement in the process. When you start seeing voices from young people brought into scrutiny and lawmaking, about issues that they care about, that's when you start having more effective. Or when you bring in groups of young people who are not from the engaged groups, then that's when it starts being effective. And that does happen, but it's much more of the former, because it's just, I won't say it's easy, but it's something that there's an expectation that parliaments should do something about engaging young people because they're seen as voting less, etc. Is that it? I don't know if I've missed something.
I think you covered everything.
Yeah?
Yes. Yeah. All right. So then I think we should conclude now. Mm-hmm. There's still a coffee. There's coffee and tea outside, so we can still continue the debate outside. But for now, I think we just want to thank Cristina very much for this very exciting, interesting lecture. And also thank you for all your questions.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Very good questions.
And we'll see each other next week on Tuesday when Tanya will deliver her Big Ideas for Democracy lecture here at BrIAS on Feminist Institute. You know the title better than I do. Feminist institutions. Institutionalism?
Yeah, and what happens when feminists are not leading policies?
Yeah. And what happens when feminists are not in the room? They are not leading the policies. So everybody very much welcome on Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. All right? So
I wish I was here for that.
Yeah, you can always come to Brussels, Cristina. Come back to us. All right, so have a good afternoon and see you soon. Bye.